Elise, I'm going to apologize. I don't know if you pronounce your last name Desjarlais or Desjarlais or something else.
It is Desjarlais.
Desjarlais, very good. And then Joe Kaplan is also here. Are the three of you pretty comfortable with how this works? We've got a couple minutes if you have any questions.
Should be good.
The order that I have you set for is Jill, then Elise, then Joe. But if you'd like to change that around, we can. Are you happy with the order we've got?
I'm good. You guys?
Yeah, that works for me.
And according to my notes, oh, excellent. Thanks, Joe. According to my notes, because we have 3 speakers, we're generally targeting 15 minutes each. And then at that point, we would open things to the Q&A. Anybody who is watching us today, first, thank you. And second, if you have questions or comments, feel free to type them into the Q&A and I'll read them for you at the end and get responses. Any questions or any housekeeping before we get started? We'll get started in about a minute or so.
Can I start sharing my screen?
Yeah.
I made a pretty, thing.
A pretty thing. Well, by all
title slide. I made a pretty
fishy.
title slide, so.
That's a very fishy title slide.
Yeah.
Fish. It's got a very cool artistic look to it too, like the Starry Nights painting.
Exactly.
Let's see. So my plan is that I'll introduce you individually as you get started, rather than introducing all 3 of you now. Does that work?
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All
Hey,
right.
Joe.
Hi.
How goes it?
Pretty good. I have just one quick question. So when it's time for me to go, I would just hit that share screen on the bottom.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yep. And then it's just mirroring your screen. And if you want to hide the controls, then you can do that in those little windows. It's one of the options in Zoom.
Okay.
You get them back with escape, so you're not
Gotcha.
stuck there forever.
Okay.
Because we're using one of the webinar accounts rather than one of the meeting accounts, I will tell you, your screens look a little different than what our presenters are seeing. So you can see the Brady Bunch tiles for all of the speakers, presenters who are connected right now, as well as NMU AV. The participants who are watching the webinar can only see right now, they're seeing Jill's very pretty slide with her fish skin. And then they can see right now, they can see a small thumbnail of me, but as soon as I stop talking and Jill starts, it will automatically kick over so that it's the video of the one who's talking. Okay?
Groovy.
Okay. In that case, I think we're ready to get started. So it is always my honor to introduce Dr. Jill Leonard. Dr. Jill Leonard has been with the biology department for 20 years. And when not teaching courses, she has spent much of her time researching cold water stream fish communities with a special interest in life history variation, physiological ecology, and the effects of environmental change. For those of you who haven't been downstairs in West Science, she's got an aquatics lab down there that's pretty awesome with all sorts of fishy things and special fishy lab equipment, so that she could even do breathing tests on fish, which fascinated me at first because I was trying to figure out how do you attach the little hoses when they don't have noses, but she has strategies. That's, by the way, is not on the script. I ad-libbed that. Jill probably knows. Jill is also a recipient of Northern's highest honor for faculty. She has received the Distinguished Faculty Award at Northern, and it is a credit to us and to Northern to have her here with us. So, Jill, take it away.
Okay, so hopefully folks can see me, and I hope that you can also see my pretty fish skin title slide. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and I want to thank the folks who put together the Sonderegger Symposium for welcoming those of us who are interested in something a little different than a traditional topic for Sonderegger. And so I'm very pleased to be part of this sort of little mini symposium with Elise and Joe, who are going to follow me off in a few minutes. And I think that maybe you'll see a theme by the time that we're all done today. So I'm going to start us off. I'm certainly going to talk about fish, but I really want to talk about communities. That's really what the Sonderegger is about. We're talking about the Upper Peninsula and the community of folks that live here. And we always think about what makes that community, who is present, who comes, who goes, and what are those interactions between the members of the community here in the UP. And of course, we're really curious about how do communities change over time. Well, those of us who are on the science side of things and on the environmental side of things, we think about exactly those same questions when it comes to biological communities. So biological communities are groups of organisms, groups of species that use the same environment. And that incorporates lots of things that you've heard about, that covers things like food webs and other competitive interactions, but we're really trying to understand how these different species work together, work against each other, interact, and they become the biological Upers that we all know and love. So often when you think about biological communities, they're grouped by type of organism. So that's a taxa or taxon, as well as the locale. So you might think about the Upper Peninsula fish community, or the Great Lake or Lake Superior fish community, or even the fish community in Little Whetstone Brook. All of those are ways for us to think about the bounds to the different communities that we're interested in. And it's, of course, also true that biological communities change over time, just like human communities do. And that's a really interesting thing for those of us who work in this area. So I guess my first question and thing to think a little bit about is, how did we form our UP fish community in the first place? Fish, of course, evolved a long time ago, long before the last ice age, but we've all remember our geology classes enough to know that this area was completely glaciated. And so it kind of looks like this little picture I have down here in the corner. At the edge of the glacier, you might have up to a mile of ice sitting on top of the lands. Clearly, this is not great fish habitat, and during the period of that last glaciation, fish were excluded from the area that we now think of as of the UP. So what that really means then is that as the glaciers receded, it was essentially a blank slate for our community. And so at some level, all of the fish that we're going to talk about were colonists to this area. And they returned from glacial refugia that were either generally thought to be down in the Mississippi River region, or actually up off what we now think of as ocean, but at that point it was flooded with fresh water because of the ice itself. And so fish would have been able to reinvade from the Mississippi drainage and from the St. Lawrence River, from the Seaway. And that process was happening, you know, around about 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, and even a bit more recent from that. And so our initial community, I guess we can think of them as native community, if we like. Our initial community is those species, those individuals of those species that could disperse to the region. So they had essentially the skill set to come here, and that could weather those continued changes. The end of that most recent ice age was a period of enormous upheaval and change, and it was just a tough place to live. And so the fish that we now see, that we think of as our native species, were essentially those that could go through all of that process and then make a new home here in the UP. So who do we talk about when we talk about our current fish community? Well, so it's really a diverse group of fishes, and so there is a tremendous amount of diversity in fishes. So we have lots of white fishes, the whitefish, cisco, lake herring, trouts like lake trout and brook trout, sturgeon, the sunfishes, so the bluegill and some of the basses, things like sculpins, and lots of other species as well that many of you have gone fishing for or have seen in your travels around the UP. Those communities will differ and vary a little bit based on whether you're looking at the Great Lake or an inland lake, or if you're talking about a particular stream. And those differences are very much driven by the temperature of the water velocity, but also things like habitat structure and what is there to eat. Is it appropriate for particular species? So we all know that the fish that live in a stream are not necessarily the same ones that live in Lake Superior. But if you take this poster, which is in every lab I teach in, and you look at it a little more closely, you're going to see some things that are perhaps surprising. So I have circles around a whole bunch of fish species that many folks are familiar with, but everything that's circled on this poster would be considered non-native. And by non-native in this case, I'm talking about things like sea lamprey and rainbow trout, rainbow smelt, rainbow trout too, round goby, at least in Lake Michigan so far, brown trout, the Pacific salmon, and I mean things that didn't get here on their own. So they didn't do that dispersal themselves post-glaciation. Instead, they were able to usually be transported or at least facilitated by humans in some way. And so I say facilitated because this is not a simple question. There were intentional transportations of organisms here. Actually, in the early days of colonization, many of the folks coming to this region actually thought of Lake Superior as a giant water desert, and they thought they were really helping out by improving the diversity of species that are present in this giant empty puddle of water. So there were stockings for fishing purposes. There have also been stockings for ecosystem management in the Great Lakes region. So there are fish that were put here on purpose. There are also lots of fish that were not put here on purpose. So we have ballast water transport of things like round goby and ruff. We have the canal construction, the Welland Canal that allowed the sea lamprey to come in. And we have escapes from essentially enclosures, which is really the long story behind where we have alewives in Lake Michigan. So lots of different paths for these species. But if you look at my poster, it really means that a fair proportion of the fish that we think of as everyday members of our fish community, and they are members of our fish community, are also not what we would think of as potentially native species. Okay, so that brings me to one of my points I really want to talk a little bit about, and that's this idea of what's in a name. So we have all of these terms for species that we don't consider to be native to a particular environment. So I have a whole smattering of up here. So native, of course, but things like indigenous species or introduced species or exotic, I always love that one, or non-indigenous species, non-native, naturalized. And I have them colored out a little bit because these different terms tend to have different interpretations behind them. It's good to be a native or an indigenous species, and it is. It's really bad to be an invasive species. That's true. It's kind of somewhere in the middle to be naturalized or non-native or non-indigenous, and a lot of that kind of comes to an interpretation of how people want to think about different living organisms that are in our particular community. And we're going to keep thinking about these different terms a little bit as we go along. Now, I have to say, most of these terms are not defined with one exception, and that one exception is invasive. So invasive species is a term that's officially determined by the US federal government, at least if you wish to interact with them in that world. So in the eyes of the federal government, an invasive species is any species that is not native to an ecosystem and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So that seems pretty reasonable, right? I'm going to suggest, though, that it's a little trickier than it might look. And that's because we have to have, in order to apply this definition, we have to have an agreement on what's native. So is this a native species or is it not a native species? And then we have to come up with some understanding of what harm is. And we know we have some options. We have economic harm, we have environmental harm, or we have health harm, human health harm. But how much harm is required? What's bad enough to worry about? These are questions that are not insignificant when you think about what can go on with invasive species. Okay, so I'm going to consider just a couple of well-known non-natives to give us an example to think about this for. So I have here the sea lamprey, Petromyzon marinus, and the brown trout, Salmotruta. So just a tiny bit of background, although I think everybody in the Great Lakes seem to be genetically trained to know about sea lampreys. So sea lampreys are actually native to the east coast of the United States and Canada, and they invaded through the Welland Canal, through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they're now found in a non-native range throughout the Great Lakes, as well as places like Lake Champlain. So they're native to the Atlantic coastal region and considered non-native and actually invasive in the Great Lakes region. And they do have, of course, self-sustaining populations, which means they can reproduce on their own. You don't need to have new introductions. They just do their thing. The brown trout, somewhat similarly, is native to Europe. So this dark brown right here is the native range of the brown trout. It actually maybe doesn't even go over as far as they show. So they're very much a European and East and parts of Asia species. They were intentionally introduced. So the sea lamprey came here as a expansion of their range through a canal that we opened for them, whereas the brown trout came in a boat and they were placed here for purposes of fishing. Since then, however, for the most part, we in the UP think about self-sustaining populations, although there are stockings that do still go on in the Great Lakes. But they're certainly also naturalized here in our area in the UP. So I guess, so what? So what's the consequences of these two species? So these are my examples, so I should show you a little bit about that. So lamprey, I'm sure many folks know, are famous because they are a vertebrate parasite, and one of their favorite snack foods is lake trout. And so here you see a sea lamprey attached to a laker. And you can see in this other photograph some of the results. So they can make some pretty nasty wounds on lake trout. It may or may not kill them, but it often can kill them. In their native range, sea lampreys are still parasitic, but they feed on much larger organisms, big fish, whales, things like that, and they'll actually seldom kill their host, but their food here is smaller, and it's more likely that they'll end up killing their host. The data that I'm showing here is actually from the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, and it shows the decline of lake trout in blue from the beginnings of the entry of sea lamprey into the lake. This is for Lake Superior. And then you can see this precipitous decline. The red is where we started counting sea lampreys, lots of sea lampreys. And then we started doing significant treatments to try to remove and kill sea lampreys from our streams and the lake itself. And so that's the work of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Well, in the United States, the work of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Sea Lamprey Control Unit, and they partner, of course, with the Canadians on the Canadian side of the lake. And you can see that although they have not extirpated the sea lamprey, they do a pretty good job at holding them fairly low. And then here in Lake Superior, we've seen a pretty nice increase in lake trout. And in fact, lake trout and Lake Superior are self-sustaining again now. So that's a pretty clear effect that you can see from sea lamprey. So what about brown trout? Brown trout don't have that same reputation, do they? And yet, I'm showing you here some data. This is actually data we did, we were working on just this fall with my class. So this is my fisheries management course, and my students were out there. You can, if you squint, you can see they're all wearing masks. And we were fishing at this reach of Whetstone Brook. Whetstone Brook is the stream that runs through Marquette, for those of you who know your way around Marquette a little bit. It's the one that goes by McDonald's and by the new hospital and comes out in Founders Landing. And so these dots on this figure, on this picture down at the bottom, show the reach that I'm showing you the data from by our new hospital, and some fish that I have caught in this stream. So this brown trout we caught there this fall. You'll see in a second that we did not catch this brook trout above there this fall. That actually comes back from 2011. So nice fish in a teeny tiny stream. And what you can see in this data, this is actually the proportion of brook trout relative to the number of brown trout. You see that we used to catch lots of brook trout, or at least a fair number of brook trout, but for the past 8 years, we haven't seen basically any. In 2013, we caught one the 2 times we went fishing, and we really didn't see any more. We fished not only this reach, but a number of other spots in the stream, and have been so far unable to find any brook trout in this stream. Now, important to know about this stream is completely cut off from the lake because there's a barrier underneath the circle. And so the only things going on in there are very constrained by the system and access. And the only fish in this river are brook trout, brown trout, and basically now only brown trout. And that's something that we commonly see when brown trout are happy in a stream and they encounter other species of salmonids like brook trout. All right, so that's my story. Those are my examples, but what do we take home from this? So humans judge these different animals differently. And why is that? So, I never have to worry about my students, wanting to get rid of sea lampreys and they're really well-known invasive species, but why is it that they are judged so much more significant than a brown trout is? Well, maybe it's the magnitude of the interactions. I mean, certainly there are lots of lamprey, or at least there were lots of lamprey. It also certainly has something to do with the value placed on the native species that they were causing the damage of. Lake trout have commercial value, they're much beloved, and frankly, there's not much value placed on lamprey around here. Nobody fishes for them, and so there's not much competing view. They're harming something we care about, and we don't really love lamprey, although they're very cool biologically. What about the manner that the species is affected? That's probably part of it. There's a big ooh factor for a vertebrate external parasite sucking the life out of a lake trout. That's pretty easy to understand as something we might not want to have going hog wild. And there's lots of other pieces of information or sort of opinion that go into that judgment. The thing, though, is all of those values and all of those items aren't science, and they're not even environmental biology. So what we know from a scientific perspective is that both of these species create substantial change. Okay, so change is change. It means there's something different. You put these animals into an ecosystem and things are going to be different. Brook trout were the only native fish left in Whetstone, and now they're essentially gone. Is that the same thing as harm? Is it enough harm? Do we want to say that that's something to invoke this idea of an invasive species? That's a question. Currently, brown trout are considered desirable and a naturalized species. Rarely will you see anybody apply the term invasive to them in Michigan. And then there's the question of, can we get rid of our non-native? Do we even want to? We like these brown trout. And if we wanted to get rid of them, could we? Those are important questions to consider. The last thing I think that we can talk about is that ecosystems adjust to their component species. So things are going to change, whether it's improved or damaged, is really a human-based judgment. So the other piece to all of this that's important to remember is that we're not done yet. Climate change is affecting these kinds of fish communities. We know that there are predictions for changes to the fish communities in the future. So that's true for what we see for native species, for newcomers, and for invasives. So this is some data from Klein et al. In 2013, and they're showing actually that walleye, which used to have very few places in Lake Superior that they could make a living, are actually finding increasing habitat. So that's a native species to the region, but it's not really a native species to Lake Superior. And yet we find that it's going to be a new member of our fish community. Similarly, the Chinook salmon, which are a non-native, are also going to be able to do better in the future because it's warming up the lake a bit. Lean lake trout, one of the morphs of lake trout, seem to also be doing better with warming temperature, at least having more areas they can get to. But Cisco lake trout, a different native morph, are actually seeing a decline in areas that they can make a living in. So we know that there's going to be changes, and that those changes will apply to all these species regardless of what label that we put upon them. So labels come from humans' judgments for management of ecosystems, and labels matter. They matter in terms of management decisions. Do we support a species? We do indeed make habitat for brown trout and rainbow trout in the Great Lakes. Do we ignore them? There's some species we just don't sweat, we just don't worry about. Or do we try to remove them? The invasive species removal program for sea lamprey is well over $15 million just in the US every year. So that's a substantial investment to remove that species. I think it's important to remember that the decisions are based on information gathered by science, but they also include societal goals and other non-science elements. So this is using scientific information, but it's definitely not science. This is management and making decisions based on our goals. All right, so the question, of course, is how will we make these judgments in the future, and what do we want for our natural communities? I point out just from this, the rainbow trout, steelhead, and the brown trout are labeled as the IUCN Top 100 Worst Invasive Species list. Around here, we call them non-native and naturalized. Sea lampreys don't make that list globally.
And Jill, I am about to cut you off.
Yep, and I just stopped. So if there's any
Okay.
time left, then I'm happy to take questions, or people are always welcome to email me and ask me things at a later time. Although I did put some candy on here. Those are wild native brook trout spawned this week from an area in the UP.
Wow. Okay, thank you, Jill. We'll have, if you have questions for Jill, you can type them into the Q&A, and we will get to those after we've heard from Elise and Joe. So right now we're going to turn things over to Elise Desjarlais. Elise is the coordinator of the Lake to Lake Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, which coordinates invasive species management efforts across the Central Upper Peninsula. She works across Alger, Delta, Marquette, and Schoolcraft counties with various partner agencies to maintain native ecosystems in our region. And Elise is a graduate of NMU's biology department with her BS in zoology in 2013. So Elise, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. That was a great introduction.
The floor is yours.
If I share my screen correctly, we should be able to go ahead and get started. Is that working?
Yes.
Alrighty, great, thank you. Well, again, thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. The title of my talk happens to be Garlic Mustard. I can eat that, right? And we will definitely be getting through that question as we get through my presentation. I would like to thank Dr. Leonard for all of those lovely talking points. You're going to hear a little bit of overlap between our presentations here, but I think that's awesome that invasive species management has a common theme and a common goal, and consistent messaging is important. So as my introduction was saying, I coordinate Lake to Lake CISMA. In the upper left-hand corner here, you can kind of see a subset of those counties that I cover. And the CISMA, being a cooperative invasive species management area, is kind of exactly what the name implies. It is a collaborative group with many, many partners, and we all come together to work interjurisdictionally to manage invasive species. We primarily currently deal with terrestrial invasive species, and so my presentation is going to focus on plants mostly, but we do deal in aquatic invasive species as well. And what that means is that plants don't really care where we decided to draw parcel lines. And so working collaboratively with all of these different partner agencies, we are more successful in sharing resources and being able to work to better our native communities. There are CISMAs across the state of Michigan. They're not always going by that CISMA acronym. Some are CWMAs, which is Cooperative Weed Management Area. There's ISN is Invasive Species Network. So they're all kind of called different things as to what everybody decided to name themselves. But the state of Michigan is completely covered by these collaborative groups. In different states, I know into Wisconsin, we actually have a CISMA in the UP that covers a couple of Wisconsin counties as well. Wisconsin has groups that are similar to this. Most of the Great Lakes region actually has some form of collaborative group like this. And so if you're listening from not in the UP or even in Marquette, you can go and look at michigan.gov/invasives to see if you need to connect with your local CISMA or maybe a group that's even outside the state of Michigan if you're listening in. Some of the partners that are in Lake to Lake CISMA include all of these wonderful organizations here. And it's I like to highlight it as it can be open to really kind of any user group or different agency. Some things that people might think of very easily are things like UP Land Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, DNR, natural resource driven groups, but sometimes people kind of get a question mark when they see Marquette Board of Light and Power on there. Why would Board of Light and Power need to have invasive species management? Well, if there's invasive species affecting power line right-of-ways, or that could be a transportation vector for some species, we like to just include them. And so if they either need assistance or resources, they can be a partner in the CISMA and still work with us to manage invasives, whatever the case may be. So this is where Dr. Leonard's talk and mine are definitely going to overlap. What makes something invasive? So I like to say, does it check all of the boxes? And so the first question to ask, and my examples are going to be plant-based instead of fish-based, is it present in the location that calls itself its native range? So this example here is poison ivy. If you're anywhere in the state of Michigan, poison ivy is native for us. Does it harm the ecosystem? Does it harm the economy? And does it pose a human health hazard? Definitely going to argue it checks the box of posing a human health hazard, but since it's a native species, I'm not going to allocate any resources to it, neither is just about any invasive species manager. Where it does get resources allocated to some sort of management is maybe along trail systems, high user areas, because it does pose that human health hazard, but it's still a native species. So it's native, we don't love it, but it is supposed to be here. Alternatively, we have, Michigan's apple crop every year is a $1 million industry. I hope that everybody was able to enjoy a little bit of cider and all those fun activities this fall. But it's not native at all. Apples were brought over to North America many, many years ago, I think centuries ago at this point. But they're not doing harm either. Even trees that are, apple trees that might have been old homesteads that you stumble upon in old fields and old, no longer inhabited areas, they're not going crazy out there. They're not pushing out our native trees, and our native, wildlife is definitely eating them. Those white-tailed deer love them. So they're not doing any harm out to the ecosystem, and definitely not doing harm to our economy or human health. So even though they're not native, we really like them here. So something that does check all of the boxes is garlic mustard. And that is one of the 2 invasive species I'm going to talk about that are terrestrial invasives and are in our area, and Lake to Lake CISMA especially as a concern. So this is an example of garlic mustard. Is it present in its native range? That answer here is no. It was originally brought over from Europe and now has established very, very well on the East Coast and into the Great Lakes region. Does it harm the ecosystem? Absolutely. If you can see the before and after picture, this is a morning and then into the afternoon of a garlic mustard pull right along the Iron Ore Heritage Trail in downtown Marquette. And when you pull all that garlic mustard out of the picture, the native ecosystem that is left is minimal. There's bare ground that's not helping to stabilize a bank, to do any, positive ecosystem, buffering down that hillside. Harming the economy is very interesting with garlic mustard. On the bottom left here, you're seeing in the understory of a hardwood stand. And actually, garlic mustard, as part of its life phase, sends out chemicals through its root system, allelopathy, that will definitely hinder regeneration of forests. So especially in the Upper Peninsula, if this gets into wood stands that you're trying to manage for the timber industry, or even your sugar shack for your maple forests, this is going to hinder any regrowth and healthy forest regeneration. And it doesn't really pose a human health hazard, but it checks enough of the other boxes that it's not supposed to be here. It's crowding out our native species. It's invasive. There is a common theme with the 2 different species I'm going to be talking about. And so to introduce the other one really quick, I will be talking about Phragmites, specifically Phragmites australis. It is a wetland invader that we do have a native strain, and I'll get into that in just a second. But in both of these plants' native range, they were very much useful. They were brought with us for a reason. Garlic mustard, and here's the title, yes, you can eat it. It was brought over because it was a garden herb in Europe, and it was used in culinary applications such as the pesto pictured here. It is currently known as wild garlic over in Britain, and I've heard that people have fun foraging for it as a springtime, like how we maybe go forage for ramps or leeks. And Phragmites is used, actually, it has different lineages and different strains worldwide. And everywhere where it exists has been used for different things. Like in this example, everything's getting bundled for roof thatching. I've read that it's been made for flooring, you know, kind of mats to do a basic flooring. It's been very important for different cultural groups all around the world in the places where it is native. So to do a little bit more touching on Phragmites, as I mentioned, we do have our native Phragmites americanus, and then it unintentionally brought over was Phragmites australis. And this is a side-by-side photo of both our native and non-native. The native is staying shorter. It's kind of what I call playing nice. It's letting other vegetation disperse within it. The seed heads aren't quite as vigorous as this non-native stand that has clumped in there. You can see how much more dense that is. Those seed heads are much higher, which gives it a greater chance of dispersal, and many, many more seeds per head on those. So Phragmites in the native variety, it's much more aggressive, is not serving that ecological function that we need it to. Phragmites was estimated to have arrived, as I said, on accident as ballast material. It's been here for a very long time. It is extremely established on the East Coast, and it is getting into the Great Lakes region. And there have been very strong control efforts, especially within Lake-to-Lake CISMA through partners with Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. UPRC&D Council has done multiple different grants to manage it along, especially our Lake Michigan shoreline in the Upper Peninsula. And there are currently funds and groups working to battle this still in Green Bay, Saginaw Bay, and any other locations through the Great Lakes where it's really, really starting to get a foothold. So these are pictures from our field season, and on the left here is a grouping of invasive Phragmites that was found actually at Peninsula Point down in the Stonington Peninsula in Delta County, if anybody's familiar with the Upper Peninsula. And this is really kind of detrimental to this area because it's interrupting a lot of crucial coastal wetland habitat functions. And strangely enough, at this area, it was actually really fun to be out there and kind of map out the differences, because if you did a 180 of where this picture was taken, right behind me out in the water was actually native Phragmites growing. So it's also very important to keep an eye out for, not all Phragmites here is going to be the invasive, and we really need to maintain those native patches so they can be the ones reproducing and existing within their ecosystem. But this invader is also kind of creeping inland. If you can see on the right-hand side here, this is a property well kind of on the border of Marquette and Delta County. And it came in after a logging operation in this hardwood stand that is going into a cedar swamp area. So this is not just you know, typical, you think of a wetland, coastal wetland, you know, marshes, bogs, that type of thing. It can also be existing inland as well. And so it's disrupting many, many habitat types. And then jumping back to garlic mustard, this one was actually intentionally brought in, as I said, as a garden herb. The earliest record is from Long Island, New York in 1868. That was a little fun fact from MSU Extension. It escaped cultivation and is now found actually throughout North America. The earliest, you know, escaping in the New England area and working its way through the Great Lakes, but it's been found all the way through most of the United States now. We see monitoring plots every year. On the right-hand side is a volunteer poll that I led, and we have much of our funding is going to still managing this in the Lake-to-Lake CISMA area. So what can we do about some of these species? You know, we're not managing for them like some of Dr. Leonard's examples with fish. We're not managing for any of these species. We're not doing fisheries. You know, they're not stocking any of these. So invasive species in the plant world is mostly a removal and preventative effort at this point. So being knowledgeable on what is in our area, both native and non-native, is a really good way to start. If you're out in the woods and you know what's native and what's maybe not supposed to be there, it always gives us a one-up and gives you a one-up as to how you can be out and looking at all of our really cool plant communities. And knowing what you're walking through might give you a better indication as to how to decontaminate and maybe not be that transportation vector. If you know that that burr that maybe is on your coat right there is an invasive species, you can pull it off right at that site, keep it where it is, and at a hyper-local level, you're leaving it where you found it, basically. The same goes with using some of these boot brush stations you might see at recreational trailheads. And then to poke fun at 2020, please don't plant any unsolicited seeds that come in from overseas, things that are very blatantly obvious of how to maybe not start new introductions. And help with any of these topics, identification, what to do for decontamination, can be found with local resources, either your local CISMA, conservation districts are a very good way to find some of these resources. The same goes for some of our nonprofit environmental groups. And then there are always state and federal resources out there with best management practices and ID guides. And another way that would be really great if everybody could help out with is this app called MISSIN. It's the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. There is a app version on your phone if you would like to download it. Otherwise, you can just go on as a web page and browse, and it gives you identification assistance and a way to actually report invasive species. So if you're out somewhere recreating and you see, a clump of this garlic mustard growing, you're like, I don't know if anybody knows about this yet. You can actually take this app on your phone, hit report, and that if you're in that 4-county area, that is my CISMA area to coordinate, it actually just alerts me directly with an email of a random, your information is kept private if you wish. So it could be anonymous, but it alerts me that somebody was out and found a new population, and then I'm able to take that information and prioritize it as I can for treatment options. And then there's always doing your little best in your backyard. We're finding more and more, and there's more and more information every day about how little pockets of biodiversity, especially native biodiversity, are going such a long way to help our local native ecosystems. And so planting native species, or at least things that might not become invasive, avoiding some of those potentially invasive species in backyard plantings is even just a small step in the right direction. So that is how we can all kind of take small steps to reduce some of the presence of these in the environment. And with that, thank you. I really appreciate being here for this presentation today. That's my contact information. If anybody needs to get a hold of me, definitely questions and answers towards the end of this. But if something isn't able to be answered in this little time frame, please feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email, anything like that. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Elise. A reminder to the participants, if you'd like to ask Elise any questions, you're welcome to type your questions into the Q&A section. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I'm guessing. And then I'll read those questions to our presenters, questions or comments, I'll read them to our presenters after the third presentation. Our third presentation is from Joe Kaplan. Joe is the Director of Common Coast Research and Conservation, a nonprofit that specializes in migratory bird conservation. Joe's a former director of the Whitefish Point Bird Observatory and was instrumental in securing an extension of Scenic National Wildlife Refuge at the point. Joe lives in Delta County, and let's see. Well, he does lots of things. He's coordinating with the Escanaba Migratory Bird Enhancement Initiative to create stopover habitat and provide nest boxes for neotropical migrants in the city's waterfront parks. So, Joe, you ready to get started?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, let's see if I can start screen.
All right.
And view. Do you see it?
I do not.
Ooh, you don't.
I do not.
Oh, how about now?
Now I do. Yep.
Does it look
we're
good?
all set.
You know the bird?
No.
All right. Chestnut-sided warbler. Well, great. I'm glad to be going last after Jill and Elise, so I don't have to explain what invasive species are. I love the idea of community. Certainly birds, which is my primary focus in as far as my work in conservation, are occupy many different kind of communities. So I'll be talking about terrestrial and aquatic birds and change over time. This particular bird here singing is called a chestnut-sided warbler. And probably the most unique fact about this is it's a bird of secondary forest, cut over areas. John James Audubon, sort of the father of American ornithology, only saw this species twice in his lifetime. And it's one of our most common warblers, of which in the Upper Peninsula we have about 30. So lots of change over time. Given the fact that this is a bird of scrubby areas, you can imagine what the forests were like during the time of John James Audubon and what has changed since. Okay. Are you still with me? Good. So when we're talking about bird how and change, I just kind of came up with these 6 different ideas of how birds are impacted. Because when we take a look from an Upper Peninsula perspective, there really isn't invasive birds. We basically have 3, rock pigeon, European starling, and house sparrow. And all 3 of those really don't impact native bird communities, with maybe the exception of starlings. But when I think about invasives and the impact on birds, the impact is tremendous. And certainly my thoughts towards invasive species has changed remarkably in the last 30 years as a biologist. So this is an important slide to note because birds are often used as bioindicators. Literally, they were used as a canary in the coal mine because they're so sensitive to environmental change, especially pollutants. So birds were taken down in mines, I think up until about 1965. And if a canary or that bird died in the cage, it was time for the miners to come back to the surface. So the things that, when I think about change in bird populations, these are the big 6 for me. Habitat modification, which I'll talk about quite a bit. Exploitation, which is really something of the past. And I'm thinking about like hunting or exploiting species. A lot of that ended in the early part of the last century with Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which basically gives blanket protection over all migratory species and careful monitoring of harvest. So exploitation is a thing of the past, but I'll give it one example of how long it took to recover a population that was exploited. Pesticides and obstacles, these can be intentional or unintentional. When I say obstacles, in the last 40 years that I've been a birder, I've seen a tremendous decrease in the number of birds. Is not as so much the species, of which the Upper Peninsula has about 300 to 350, but as far as the numbers. And I think that one of the leading causes that's underappreciated is the unintentional take of birds from tall buildings, communication towers, and more recently things like wind farms, which are still pretty minor in the landscape, but there's a lot of proposals to build bigger and taller obstacles like wind turbines for birds. And the thing is, birds collide with these collision risk increases when there's lights on at night, because most of our migratory birds, they're susceptible to collision risk because they orientate at night. And a lot of the birds that leave the UP for the tropics could be confused by lights in tall buildings when they're up in the column migrating at night. That creates quite a problem for them. Probably the best examples from the Great Lakes is in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. There's a country doctor who monitored a television tower, a 1,000-foot television tower over 40 years, and documented 125,000 dead birds. His biggest nights were 30,000 dead migrants at the base of this television tower in the mid-1960s. We don't see anything like that anymore, but certainly that had a huge impact on bird populations. Species competition, I'll talk a little bit about that. An example, of course, invasive species, not so much birds, but plants and aquatic invasives have had a tremendous impact on our bird populations and probably will drive the future. And of course, all of these things interact with climate change. So just an example of birds that have changed. A great thing about using birds as bioindicators is that there's, from an amateur perspective, amateur contributions from birders really exceed that of professionals, and it's one of the few fields of science where the amateur contribution is really does give you such a tremendous coverage. This was the Michigan Breeding Bird Atlas. It was the first atlas was 1983 to 88. The second atlas was 2002 to 2008, and basically this was a huge volunteer effort to go out and canvass townships in Michigan and record breeding birds. And fortunately, Michigan has 2 atlases, and from that, it documented a lot of the changes that birders have noticed, like myself, over the last 40 years being active in the field. Something like sandhill crane. I remember in 1996 when I got a report from Isle Royal of a crane, and it was the first time since the 1920s. And you can see from Atlas 2, from Atlas 1 to Atlas 2, it a really large expanse for sandhill cranes. And that's probably from 2 factors. 1, protection of wetlands, and 2, the fact that sandhill cranes used to be a staple on the menu of hunters. So, and there's been effort now that populations have recovered to put them back, consider them a game species instead of non-game species. I think the call is ribeye of the sky. I've never had crane, but I understand where they're hunted. They are preferred by hunters. The problem with hunting cranes is that they have among the longest breeding season in Michigan for any species. They arrive in March and depart in November with their 1 or 2 chicks and teach them that migration route. So when you shoot a crane, you're really taking out a family, and there's really no excess in the population for that type of harvest. So when you shoot a crane, you're spending down principal and not interest. The second one, Connecticut warbler. This is a boreal species. Again, reflecting in the last 20 years, 30 years, a gradual disappearance and almost complete absence now from the Upper Peninsula. Never a very numerous species, but in spruce bogs and jack pines, you could find it quite regularly through the 80s and 90s. But since about 2000, we've seen quite a decline. And even since 2008, when the atlas was completed, we're quickly losing this boreal species. Now it's interesting because something like a Connecticut warbler is at the very southern end of its range. So it's going to be sensitive to range retractions. This is a bird of the boreal forest, and it reflects what's happened to many of our other boreal species in the Upper Peninsula, possibly because of forest management and also warming trends, but not entirely known. And then the third one I like to point out is double-crested cormorant, which just about everybody in the UP believes was introduced by the DNR. That's false. This was a species that was very rare on the Great Lakes, but was present and has benefited from 2 things. One is it was released from suppression from pesticides, especially DDT, and has made tremendous recovery along with things like bald eagles, Cooper's hawks, and osprey over the last 30 years. And it's also benefited from a lot of introductions of forage fish, things like round gobies and alewives, what Jill was talking about. Now, probably those are birds that have changed. Probably the most famous example for a bird in Michigan is Kirtland's warbler, which until this year was considered or was on the endangered species list. This is a bird that in 1951 was known only from 432 singing males, and then declined in late 1987 to about 167. And then there was a tremendous effort to manage for Kirtland's warblers. And in the last 20 years, the range expansion of this Kirtland's warbler, which is a species that nests in the Bahamas, has expanded into the UP. So this is one of the biggest winners in the last 20 years. And Kirtland's warblers are completely dependent on jack pine. And jack pine is a fire-dependent species. So Kirtland's warblers will only occupy young stands of jack pines and then move on. So when you think about habitat and change, there's a time scale, and then everything with habitat is disturbance and succession. But if you look at the big picture for Kirtland's warbler, over in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that green range. That's the range of jack pine across North America. And as you can see, Kirtland's warbler only occupies a very southern aspect of that, which probably reflects a change over the continent over the last 10 to 15,000 years from a geologic perspective, and then also a change more recently, probably in the last 5,000 years. Really interesting case study. When I think about the Upper Peninsula and change from habitat, the thing that comes to mind is really the exploitation of lumber from the mid 1800s to the late 1800s, with the peak in the 1880s with the harvest of white pine. And just to put this in perspective, the harvest of white pine in Michigan peaked in the 1888, and it was equal to all the white pines growing in Michigan today. Now, because of that incredible clearing of the forest and subsequent fires, there were winners and losers. Upper left-hand corner, sharp-tailed grouse was a winner because it converted old growth forest into open areas. And of course, something like pileated woodpecker was a loser because it depends on older forests. And this reflects in the last 30 years. We've seen a decrease as forests have increased, a decrease in sharp-tailed grouse, and an increase in pileated woodpecker. The other big change that I don't think we fully appreciate is water levels. So I moved to Escanaba in 2009 and got involved with controlling the green patches, invasive Phragmites, and we treated 56 stands on our lakeshore during a time when water levels were very low. 4 years later, look how much things changed in the relative span of 3 years. In the last 6 years, we've increased, since 2013, we've increased 6 feet of water on Lake Michigan. So trying to measure how that impacts populations is really difficult. This is a species I study, it's black tern, another species that has declined quite a bit in the UP, depends completely on last year's detritus on in emergent wetlands. And as you can see, one of the implications of climate change is increased summer storms. And this series on the left was a time-lapse series I took where the tern at the top survived a rainstorm and then was sitting on the nest, but then the seiche that came up later completely inundated the nest. And an interesting thing about native and non-native Phragmites is native Phragmites break down and create substrate for this tern to nest on. Non-native Phragmites do not, they persist. So there's an ecological difference between those two types of plants in how they interact in these ecosystems. A favorite of mine is purple martins. This was the biggest declining species between the two atlases. What's unique about purple martins, we're at the northern periphery of the range, unlike some of the other examples I showed of the southern periphery, and completely dependent on people for putting up nest sites. So all the original habitat this bird occupied is gone. It probably was wiped out by the Pilgrims because, of course, the devil lived in those gigantic red oaks that the Pilgrims settlers found when they first got to North America. And then also more recently with climate changes, there seems to be an expansion of European starling, which is a nest competitor with purple martin. So with the decline of people maintaining houses and those houses being occupied by starlings, we saw 95% range retraction that can be undone with specialized nest boxes. And Escanaba is one of the last colonies that is known or documented in the UP, and we're starting to turn the corner, figuring out how to control starlings and bring the species back, or at least not lose it. And then finally, my disproportion of my time has been monitoring loons for the last 30 years. This is an individual who's 32 years old this year. He's been with his mate 20 years. They've produced over 30 chicks. And back, and you look at the lower left-hand corner, look at the change in this loon population from 1987, when this chick was hatched, to 2017. And you notice it was a steady increase until 2012, 2013. And since then, we've lost 40% of the loon population at Seney. We're looking at different factors that might be impacting that. Invasive disease, if you think of it that way, like West Nile virus. We have a West Nile virus, but probably the largest factor is changes that have happened on northern Lake Michigan and really all of the Great Lakes, sans Lake Superior. And Jill touched on this a little bit, but this is a really interesting interaction of what happens when invasive species come to dominate your ecosystem. Dracinid mussels were introduced via ballast water back in the 80s. The first one was a zebra mussel. That wasn't good enough, so we introduced quagga, which can colonize substrate. And then what that did is it changed the ecosystem on Lake Michigan to allow for the proliferation of a native algae called Cladophora. Well, in the fall, when that algae senesces, it overwhelms the system, turns it anoxic, depletes all the oxygen, and then a strain of botulism that's endemic to the Great Lakes proliferates, produces a toxin that then somehow works up the food chain, probably because of the proliferation around goby, another ballast introduction, and ultimately ends up in the common loon and other water bird species. And when I think about an invasive species nightmare, this is the one that comes to mind, because on the Great Lakes in the last 20 years, we've lost clearly easily over 100,000 species, or I'm sorry, 100,000 individuals of these native water birds. And they're on northern Lake Michigan at this time of year when this is happening, because they're on their way to their wintering grounds, and they're doing molt and feeding. So these type of changes in the environment can be really catastrophic. And invasive species, of course, is one of the main drivers.
Joe, I'm sorry, I have to.
I'm done.
You're done?
That was
Well,
it.
timing. That is
Pardon?
good. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, not at all. I just wanted to end on a nice image, since, yeah, I don't get invited to parties anymore, especially now that botulism is part of our system. But I appreciate the attention, and it was great to present along with Jill and Elise, and yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. I will tell the three of you, there was one question though in the chat from Dr. Lindsay. Dr. Alec Lindsay is asking if we should just learn to live with the invasive species if they're here to stay. Unfortunately, we don't have time for you to give him an answer, because I suspect that each of you has an answer to that question about how we decide which species to learn to live with and which ones to continue to fight. But I will leave it to you guys to be in touch with Alec and to have that conversation on the side. Fair enough, but thank you,
Jill, yeah, you're welcome.
and
Thank
Jill. And we will now turn things around a little bit to talk about why the UP looks this way. We're going to talk about some of the architecture and the history of photo history of Glen. And let me get my, oh, Joe, you are still sharing your screen.
I'm done. Here, let me get
a whole
there we go.
lot of
Sorry.
files on your desktop.
Am I done?
You're done. You are
Great.
so done. And we have Jack and Steve who are already here. Jack and Steve, before I introduce you, do you have any questions or need anything to get oriented, or are you doing okay?
I'm doing okay. Can you hear me okay?